Hello and welcome to Korean with Val. In this first lesson, we're going to talk about Korean parts of speech. Learning about the different types of words and how they function will help us see the Korean language as a system. It will help us see its logic. All in all, Korean has 9 parts of speech: nouns, pronouns, particles, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, adnouns, numbers, and interjections. We are going to talk about all of them in order, and at the end, we're going to look at some simple example sentences. Let's start with nouns. Luckily for us, Korean nouns are relatively easy. They have no articles, no plurals, no cases, and no gender. This means they don't really change. So when you learn a new noun, you mostly need to learn its meaning. There is usually no additional grammatical info to learn. Next, we have pronouns. Pronouns are words that replace nouns, mostly to avoid repeating the same noun over and over again. But in Korean, they aren't used nearly as often as in English. In Korean, pronouns are often dropped, and some are even consciously avoided. For example, the pronoun you. You is used all the time in English, but in Korean, you should use the person's relation to you, or their title, or their position. Also, even when you do use pronouns in Korean, be aware that some have formal and informal forms, so you have to be careful. As you can see so far, nouns don't change, and pronouns are usually dropped. So where do we get important grammatical information from? One part of the answer are particles. They attach to nouns or pronouns with no space in between. Some are more grammatical, for example. They tell us which noun is the subject and which is the object, and some give additional meaning, similar to English prepositions like and, with, to, from, and so on. At this point, you may wonder why they say Korean is difficult. Well, it is because of this next section, verbs and adjectives. Now I should probably first tell you why I put these two together instead of separately. It is because Korean adjectives are actually verbs. Yes, it might sound a bit strange, but it is true. When you use an adjective in Korean, you don't need to add the verb be, for example, because the adjective already has the meaning of be in it. So instead of saying Korean is difficult, you would just say Korean difficult. You can still call them adjectives if you want to, but be aware that they are verbs and that they can do all the things verbs can do. And in Korean, verbs do everything. They are the most important and most complex part of Korean grammar. They are what makes Korean both difficult and beautiful. As do verbs in most languages, Korean verbs have different endings for different tenses: present, past, future. They have passive forms and some of the verbs are irregular. However, Korean has something not a lot of languages have. It has distinct levels of formality. What this means is that when you are talking to someone older than you will use different verb forms than when you're talking to someone younger than you. When you are talking to your boss, you will use different forms than when you're talking to your friend. This is what multiplies the number of endings a verb can take. The choice is triple, quadruple, and even more. And if that's not enough to cause a headache, Korean doesn't have conjunctions. So how do you think we connect sentences and clauses? By adding endings to verbs, of course. But please don't give up. Once you master the verbs, you have mastered the majority of Korean grammar. As we said, the nouns don't change, and the adjectives are actually verbs, and the other parts of speech are relatively easy too. I promise. With this huge section, we are halfway done. The next part of speech is adverbs, which modify verbs and adjectives. Adverbs are words like very, really, and all those words on ly in English. Korean adverbs mostly function the same as adverbs in English. Next, we have adnouns. They modify nouns. There is a very limited number of them. Numbers are a bit trickier. because Korean has two sets of numbers. One set is of Sino-Korean origin, and one is of pure Korean origin. And they are used with different nouns and in different situations. They also need to come with counters, words similar to, for example, loaf in a loaf of bread. Korean has many more of those than English, and you will need to learn which counter goes with which noun. And finally, the last part of speech is the easiest. Interjections are usually just exclamations like oh and wow. They are used in the same way as in other languages. All this theory may seem a bit much or a bit boring, but trust me, it will help. To make it clearer, let's look at a few example sentences. Just a disclaimer first, I am not a native speaker, so this is just me trying my best. Our first sentence is a very simple one. 나는 너를 사랑해. We said verbs are the most important part, so let's find the verb first. In Korean, verbs are at the end of the sentence. The verb here is 사랑해. It is the verb to love in the present tense. It is in its informal form. Actually, this whole sentence is informal. So now that we know love is in the air, let's see who loves who. The first word, na, is a pronoun. It means I or me. It is in its informal form. Nun is attached directly to it. It's a particle, a topic particle. It tells us that I is the topic of the sentence. Then we have no, which is another pronoun. It means you, and again, this is an informal form. Attached to it is ru, the object particle. It tells us that you is the object of the sentence. So what does this sentence mean? Of course, it means I love you. Literally, it is I, topic particle, you, object particle, love. Verb at the end, particles attached to the pronouns. You can see clearly how different the word order is from English, but you will get used to it in time. One more thing, if you remember, we said Korean often drops pronouns. So this sentence could simply be just 사랑해. You've probably seen and heard it a million times. From context, it would be clear that it means I love you, even if there are no pronouns. English can't really do this. You can't say just love to mean I love you. Our second sentence is a bit longer, but the structure is very similar. The verb is at the end, 가요, this time in formal form. It means to go. The first part of the sentence is the same as in the previous one. Pronoun na, I, me, and topic particle nun. Then we have 매일, which is an adverb. It means every day. 친구 is a noun meaning friend, and 랑 is another particle. It means with. 학교 is another noun. It means school, and 에 is a particle usually for location. So can you piece together what the whole sentence means? We have I, topic particle, every day, friend, with, school, to, go. I go to school with my friend every day. Does it make sense? Is it too hard? Do you have any questions? If you do, leave them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. Remember, I'm just a learner, same as you. That's it for this lesson, and next time we'll cover nouns in more detail. Thank you so much for joining me today. See you next time.